You're with the Retro Hour podcast, and we're here today with Norman Cook. And Norman Cook, you know, he's a lover of retro technology, and he's done some pretty amazing stuff over time. The House Martins, of course, Beats International, and Fatboy Slim. How you doing, Norman?
I'm good. How are you doing?
Great. It's good to have you on. When I messaged you, you said you know nothing about video games. So, yeah, coming on this podcast.
I know nothing about video games. I know very little about technology. It's weird because of the music I make and what I do for a living. People assume that I'm a tech geek and like up on everything, but I am actually. I call myself a late adopter. My friends call me a Luddite. But I'm very suspicious about technology, and I like everything to like have a good 5-year gestation period where I watch everybody else use it before I get around to getting one. So I'm not at the forefront, but that's all right because if we're going retro, I know more about Ataris probably than I do about laptops.
Oh, but, that's good to hear. That's our area.
The last game I played was Galaxians in a pub in about 1982. So the gaming's not for me. The game is not for me, and the technology, I'm dragged kicking and screaming into using it because it does things I need it to do, but I don't go looking for it. It's normally when everyone goes, Christ, you're the only person I know that hasn't got a smartphone, or the only person I know who hasn't got a laptop or hasn't got email. So yeah, I'm very much a late adopter.
Well, it's good if it's functional and you can use it. So I'm one of those people that's probably not on your podcast, but I'm one of those people that they invent something and you really get to know it and it's working absolutely perfect for you, and then they bring out a new version. Yeah. And they say, you got to upgrade. And it's like, well, I'm absolutely happy with it. Can I just not keep the old version? And then in terms of like software that I use for my work, a lot of the times I just stick on the old software. But then it gets to a point where a new operating system won't use the old software, and I'm like, oh my god! And they're like, what? You're still using version 8? We're on version 12 now, I really dislike the fact that every time they seem to have got everything right, they seem to invent a different way of doing it, which I don't particularly need or want. And sometimes you can hang on to the old stuff. I mean, I still use an iPod. Nice. Which is perfect for me, but then they stopped iTunes, and it's like no, but I can still just about use it with Apple Music. We always kind of start with a question, which is like, do you remember the first time you used a computer, or your first kind of experience of using a machine?
Well, my experience with computers was the last thing. I was at a sixth form college. And the last thing I did just before I left was to do a disco at the local hockey club to raise money for the school computer. In those days, there would be one school computer. So basically they got the first school computer after I'd left. So I had school had nothing. When I was at university, we had one afternoon using a computer. Now I did geography, and I had to look up information about settlement patterns, and I kept putting these towns in that I wanted to access, and it kept going, refer to your tutor. And I was like, oh God, how does this work? I don't want this in my life. I don't need it. And basically, I went to my tutor and I said, look, it's not working for me. He said, oh, I don't know why. And it took us 2 days to work out that I was putting the word Scunthorpe in because that was one of the towns that I wanted to do. Now you can guess what word.
I can see where this is going. Yeah.
Yeah. And that was it. I'm like, these computers are rubbish. That was 2 days of my life I'll never get back. And so that was another 10 years that I didn't use computers after that. I did actually live, when I was at college, I actually lived with someone who was a computer programmer. And we all thought he was a lunatic. But he used to say things about, every home's going to have one, every person's going to have one, and you'll get home. I used to say, I could get home and I could leave the computer running and it would be saying, Norm, dinner's in the oven, it's going to be ready at 8:15. And I'm like, I've got a piece of paper I could write that on and stick it, but he was right and I was wrong, as always.
Well, when did you start experimenting with electronic music. So I imagine, during the House Martins era, stuff like Chicago House was kind of coming through. I mean, when did you kind of discover electronic music?
I'd been playing with electronic music before the House Martins. I grew up in middle class suburban Surrey, but I really like black music. I really like funk music and soul and blues and gospel, but I kind of didn't feel that as a white suburban English person, it's like I should just be playing kind of white indie pop. So as a musician, I was in bands doing that, but as a DJ, I was playing funk music, and around that time there was the beginnings of electro and hip hop, and there was I used to go to these clubs, and you'd hear all these weird and wonderful sounds. For me, it all started with "I Feel Love" by Donna Summer. I was like a little white punk rocker, and everybody is hating on disco, and it was like the whole disco sucks movement and everything. But then this one record came out, and I'm like, oh, I like this.
That Giorgio Moroder production, yeah.
That speaks to me. So I was really into Giorgio Moroder, and this is like kind of around the sort of new romantic time going into electro. And I bought myself, I had a little setup I had an 808 and a 909 and a Juno. Everything had to be Roland because they were the only things that talked to each other.
Yeah.
And I had a MSQ 700 sequencer. So I used to sequence everything in step times. And I used to doodle about and write little electronic things. But then I was in this band with Paul Heaton, who was my mate from school, and he wrote really brilliant English white pop songs. So
amazing songs.
and they didn't need my electronic arrangements, so I played bass in his band, and we had a great time. But that allowed me to buy more equipment. And I think it was one session at the House Martins, and someone had an Atari running Creator, and they just in the downtime in the studio, they sort of showed me what you could do in terms of sequencing, and showed me and the concept of MIDI. Because obviously MIDI, you can get way more note information, and it's universal. It can talk to everything. You don't just have to buy Roland equipment. With the money that I made in the House Martins, I kind of built myself a little home studio. And then, and while I was in the House Martins, all the music that I loved was suddenly getting into the charts. Everybody, there was Cold Cut and Bomb the Bass, people that I used to DJ with, they were all making records and getting in the charts. And that was one of the reasons I left the House Martins, was like, look, this is the music I actually really love. Paul writes great songs, but this is the music I really love, and I much prefer to make that.
You did The Finest Ingredients after, which is like
oh, you do know your stuff.
Which is like a mega mix, and that was like
that was something I made at home on my Porter studio.
Were you tape splicing and doing stuff like that as well? Or
no, it wasn't. I think God, I can't try to remember how I made that. No, that was all. It was all sequenced on the MSQ, so that was pre-Atari, and then everything, all the record stuff was just scratched live over the top. It took ages, and that was the sort of stuff I was doing in my spare time. And then I made that, and then my friend who had some connections said, "Oh, we should put that out." And so we put it out in a sort of deliberately dodgy-looking anonymous bootleg. A, so that we wouldn't get sued for the samples, and B, so that no one would know that the House Martins bass player was making this weird electronic music. But everybody found out it was me, and it was in the Record Minutes dance chart as under Norman House Martin rather than DJ Megaix. But in those days there was this like the rest of the band was like, look, we can't let people, it can't come out that you're making this kind of music because all our fans will desert us. It's sacrilege. Morrissey has declared "Hang the DJ," and there was no like dance music rock crossover in those days. So but so like I said, it became untenable when that record came out, and I was more proud of that record than sort of some what I was doing with the House Martins, and that's when I made the real shift from being a jobbing bass player playing his mates' brilliant songs to learning how to be an electronic sample based producer.
You mentioned about liking electro and hip hop at that stage as well, and obviously turntablism was coming in then as well. I mean, who are some of kind of the artists and DJs who kind of really influenced you then to move in that direction?
My biggest influence was Double D and Steinsky, who were two American guys who were really good at like tape edits. And they did these things called lesson 1, lesson 2, lesson 3, which were like hip hop mega mixes, and they were just chopped up tunes where they made a tune that was just basically a medley, and they were really influential. The record that started it all for me was Adventures of Grandmaster Flash on the Wheels of Steel, which again is just the turntable. It's just Good Times by Chic, Another One Bites the Dust by Queen, bits snatches of other records, and that kind of cut up way of making records really appealed to me. So yeah, Double D and Steinsky, and then latterly the Dust Brothers, who did Paul's Boutique with the Beastie Boys. I remember by then I was firmly doing it. I was learning, trying to work out. We used to try and work out how people did things. It was like there was no internet or anything like that, and I would bump it. I would be on tour with Coldcut. I was like, "How the hell did you do that?" And they're like, "Oh, well, before we could afford samplers, we used to make loops." I never did the tape loop going on pencils around the room, but what we used to do was use a digital delay that had like a kind of 4-second memory. You would loop it on itself, and it took ages to get it in time. It's literally you just had to like tap the knob just like a tiny, smidge to get it in time. And then that drum loop would be the basis. And then you'd put everything live over the top. So, but yeah, the Dust Brothers, when I heard there was the sort of instrumental version of Paul's Boutique and the way they were just throwing stuff in and constructing pop music in a kind of music concrete way, that really appealed to me.
I was wondering then, when you went out and got the Atari, you'd obviously seen it with the House Martins, but did you see it in any other places? Because I've seen some photos of like NWA with an Atari in the background. Some people on top of the pops had them.
The first thing I did when I left the House Martins was I made a tune with Billy Bragg, because we'd been stablemates and I used to stay at his house a lot. And he said, I fancy trying to make an electronic record. Do you fancy trying with me? And I was like, yeah. So we hired an Atari. I said, I've seen this thing and I think this is how we use it. So we hired an Atari in it and an engineer to use it for a day. And we made a tune called Won't Talk About It, which I ended up releasing rather than Billy. Because he's like, we made it and we kind of liked it, but he's like, my fan base would lynch me if they hear this. It's got drum loops and stuff all over it. So that was the first time. And then, like I said, by now I've been in the House Martins, I've got some disposable income. So I invested in an Atari ST EFM, is it?
520, yeah.
520, yeah.
That was them, yeah. I mean, as someone who you mentioned, at the start of the interview, someone who, by your own admission, a bit of a technophobe, how did learning sequencing on the Atari go then? Was it a difficult process for you to pick up then, or did you take to it quite naturally?
Oh, geez, have you ever tried to program anything in step time?
No.
No.
Okay. After doing it in step time, anything is easier than that. Absolutely anything. No, this was brilliant. No, I mean, step time, you had to work out the notes and you have to put them in and then you have to put rest between them and you had to write it out as like note information. So you can only write a really rudimentary thing and then as programming drum things, you go 1, 4, 8, 12 for the kick drum, No, all of a sudden I could play something in. And I did grade 5 piano, so I could rudimentarily play things in, and it would play them back, and then you could edit them, and you could go in. No, I mean, it like I said, that was it. I used for the next 20 years, the Atari and Creator, C-Lab Creator was the and as soon as I started, they invented Cubase. No, Steinberg. There's a program called Steinberg, and everyone's like, "Oh, you can get Steinberg, you're going to summit." And I'm like, "We work a slightly different way, and I know how the Atari, I know how Creator works." No, Notator was it? Notator was the one where you could change the notes, but I knew it, and so I that started me on. I've got my technology; it does everything that I need it to do. I'm not upgrading, so I didn't upgrade, and then they invented Cubase and Logic and stuff like that, and I stayed on Creator until I got a laptop, which was possibly 30 years later.
Oh, you mastered it, and I think you mentioned MIDI earlier. How did you like set up Grow then? Having keyboards and kind of different devices.
I love the story that the reason the Ataris took off for music was that the son of the owner of the company was a musician, and he bullied his dad into putting a MIDI port into it. He was like, look, there's this thing called MIDI, while you're making it, just put a MIDI port in it. It'll be useful. Musicians can use it for music. Because that's what, in those days, no one really knew what we were going to use computers for, apart from gaming and doing your accounts, And so the music option, and then there was a thing called a uniter or uniter, which is
that was the device on the side, wasn't it?
Interface box that looked like something out of Star Trek. And was like half the size again of the Atari, but that was really good because that could split the in and the out, and then I just then got like a 10-way Philip Reese splitter, so it might have been 20, I think. So I could basically have 20 different instruments or samplers all on different MIDI channels. Well, no, it's 16, I suppose. It's 16 MIDI channels. And so I could have 16 things going, and each one had its own number. The 909 was always on channel 6. and so you just use the MIDI channel to decide which instrument you were talking to. And then most of the stuff, it would all just run live.
Yeah.
Basically, very few. I was looking through, I did a book last year, and I was looking through like the track sheets of even later Fatboy Slim stuff, and there was only by that point I had a 8-track VHS like digital recorder, but there would be like a time code on there, and there would be like some really long vocals that I didn't have room in my sampler from, and then the 303 tweaks because they were kind of done on the fly. And I mean, they're sort of things you couldn't do in those days. You could tell the 303 what notes to play, but you couldn't program the frequencies and the filters like you can now. But yeah, so the live stuff was the only stuff that everyone down, and everything else just ran straight out of the back of the sampler or the drum machine or the synth. That's the other thing with step time programming. You have to, if you do anything wrong, you have to go right back to the beginning of the song for it to know the start point. But Atari would pick up where you left off. And yeah, no, I mean, it was only, the only things that held you back was that the samples were stored on little floppy disks, and it took like 20 seconds to load a disc. Whereas now you can audition stuff, you can just flip through thousands of samples and you can just play them one at a time. Before you'd have to stop, wait 20 seconds while it
had a limited,
and you
limited length,
yeah, and you had a limited, I only had 49 seconds in the sampler. So once if there was a long, a vocal or something like that, I had to put that down on tape. And, but apart from that, everything was only like, 1 second per decision slower than it is nowadays. If you had everything set up and, you knew, I was in the studio, I was like a workaholic. I spent my whole life in the studio, so I just knew everything. I knew where everything was, and I even knew. I don't know if this resonates with you in your gaming thing. I knew when the Atari was going to crash.
Right.
Yeah.
It used to do little things. It used to do this little double flicker, and that was its way of saying, "Dad, in about 5 minutes, I'm going to crash. You better save." Yeah. That's the only thing. The difference between that and modern laptops is it didn't save as it went along, so you had to save every time you thought about it. It's like, better save just in case. But yeah, it used to crash about once a night, once a session, but it would just do this little flicker thing about 3 or 4 minutes before it did, which always meant it's okay. I'm going to save everything.
Yeah, you can see it's struggling. Yeah, let's get this saved onto disk quick.
Yeah, I don't know whether what it was, but it's the sort of thing that would be, you have to know it. You have to know that screen and have stared at that screen for so many hours to realize when it just does this little glitch.
Well, you were also DJing on Phase FM, which is an old pirate radio in Brighton. I was wondering what your pirate radio experience was like.
It was somewhat brief. We didn't really, in Brighton, it's like we wanted to be kind of like edgy and urban, but basically we weren't. It was like the pirate stations in London kind of outnumbered the number of DTI inspectors who could keep up with them. Whereas in Brighton, there was just us. So we never stayed on the air for very long. And when we first started, I just used to record the shows on cassette, on a C120 cassette, and they would play the cassette so that I didn't have to try and do the show live, and B sit there on, I don't know, the top of a hill. I don't know. They used to have to move this transmitter every weekend, so it didn't get busted. But it wasn't necessarily indoors. They would just put it at the top of a hill and then just have everything, and then play it remotely. So I mean, we did. It eventually got a license and became Juice. So I was sort of part of that tapestry. But no, it wasn't. It was something I did. I think, I don't know, maybe did 20, 30 shows my whole career.
What was the club scene in Brighton like at that time?
Vibrant, throbbing, I would say. I mean, that's the reason I moved to Brighton. I love this dance music and I loved club culture, and I lived in a town where there was none. And so all the while when I was cutting my teeth, I had to either drive down to get the train down to Brighton or up to London or at least Croydon. And so my sister had been at university 2 years before I was there. And so I used to go and visit my sister, and we'd go out in Brighton. Brighton in those days, and possibly to this day, had the highest nightclubs per capita of any city in England. Just because there was no other sort of cosmopolitan centres south of London. And so everybody south of about Reigate, where I grew up, would come into Brighton at weekends. So really punched above our weight for clubs. Really healthy gay scene, which in those days, in terms of electronic music, it was Bobby Orlando, and it was the gay scene where all the really hot records were coming out of. So I absolutely immersed myself in club culture. For when I was at college, I was out 6 nights a week in nightclubs every single night apart from one.
And there was that kind of trip hop sound that was like emerging in that whole Brighton identity at the time.
Yeah, not in those days. It was kind of it was like we called it alternative. It was basically I don't know, you play 1 minute you'd be playing Rock the Casbah by the Clash, then you'd be playing Planet Rock by Africa Bambaataa, then you'd be playing Bauhaus, and then I'd be playing Theme from the Jungle Book. So it was a bit of a mixed bag, but around the time there was the rare groove thing was going on in those days, and then the house thing started happening while I was in the House Martins, by which point I'm living in Hull, and house just in Hull there was just no culture of dance music whatsoever.
Far from Detroit.
It's it was just a barren wasteland. But they had Everything But a Girl and Fine Young Cannibals, and there was stuff going on, but it was not dance music based. So, but I had my hands full. But I mean, all the while I was in the House Martins, I was still DJing. I would still DJ at like clubs in London and clubs in Brighton. DJing, until then had always been my hobby. I never realised it would end up as my career.
Well, tell us about forming Beats International as well. I mean, did you find that format, obviously that was an excuse, I imagine, to spend more time in the studio and get more equipment. I mean, tell us a bit of the background on Beats International then. What happened there?
Well, that was when I left the House Martins. The first job I got was remixing a tune called I Know You Got Soul by Eric B. and Rakim. And it was just a friend of mine who I'd been through the House Martins. He ran Cool Tempo, which is the dance music version of Chrysalis, which we were signed to. So, and he just said, I've got the rights to, I think Coldcut had just done Paid in Full. And they said, we've got the rights to I Know You Got Soul. How could we do what Coldcut did? And I'm like, well, there was an a cappella on the B-side, so you could spin the a cappella over. And I was trying to explain it to him, and I wasn't explaining it very well. So I said, look, shall I demo it up for you? And so I did a demo where I looped up the Jackson 5, I Want You Back, and I played it to him, and he said, that's brilliant, we'll put it out. I was like, it was done on a cassette 4-track. It's probably not best not to put it out. So he put me in the studio, and that's just started. Literally within a month of leaving the House Martins, I had this career as a remixer. And I did that for about a year and made quite a name for myself. And then my old record company from the House Martins days realised I was still signed to them in my House Martins contract, and said, look, you're making all these records for other people. Why don't you make them for us and, make them as yourself? And so Beats International was, the first single was actually Norman Cook featuring Billy Bragg. And then there was Norman Cook featuring Lester. And then it was like, this is untenable. Norman Cook, my name isn't Norman Cook featuring. So we decided to call it. But that came out of my DJing. It was just, Beats International was basically my mates who, when I used to DJ, they used to rap over the top. And that was around the time of Smith and Mighty and the Wild Bunch and Soul to Soul and all these sort of DJ collectives. So we were like kind of Brighton's version of that. And so I just got my mates to sort of sing over beats that I was doing, and that turned into a pop band.
And you were doing a lot of stuff with multi-track recording as well, and was it tape-based, a lot of it?
Yeah, everything was done on 2-inch tape. Again, a lot of it was still run live, depending on how many tracks we needed. For the next 5 years, probably, I was using 2-inch multi-track until I started making records at home again. The interesting thing about Beats International was I was pretty much using that music concrete cut-up technique, but also bringing with it a pop sensibility of having played in a pop band where you understand the structure of a pop song. And so I was kind of, I think that was ever since then, really, that's been my talent, is using kind of the edgy end of what's happening in dance music, but also having a pop sensibility in the way you put it together.
Delving into some more of the equipment that you were using, the Akai S950. What's so special about that then? And when did you get hold of one of those?
That was my second sampler. First one I got was a Roland S10, which had 4 seconds of sampling in it. And it was like, you could have a kick, snare and a hi-hat and one note of a bass line, or you could have one drum loop. So again, you have to put everything down on tape and then load the disc back up and then try again. So it wasn't ideal. But then the S950 was the S900 was the first sort of affordable sampler that did everything and was a professional one. And then the S950, they just tightened it up and it had filters on it. And I think the original ones had 12 seconds of sampling in, which doesn't seem much if you think you've got to get a whole tune out of 12 seconds. But if you're MIDI, it could be done. And then you could put an extra board in and you could get it up to 25. And I think eventually I got it up to 49 seconds in each one. But again, because I knew it inside out, I used it every day for 2 years, did my 10,000 hours, and I knew everything that it did. And so the only thing it couldn't do was longer sample length. So I just bought another one. So I had 2 S950s, and when I ran out of space on that, I just had the other one running. But still to this day, it did, I could still make you a pretty decent record on S950. A lot of people go on about it's like, it had like 8-bit something and it sounded really crunchy. I can't really tell the difference. It wasn't because of that. It was just because I knew how it worked. And it had a really good reverse loop. So obviously you can loop the end of a note, but you get that boom, 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 roughly, no matter how well you do it, you edit it. But this had a reverse loop, so it go boom, which sounded better, and no other sampler did that. And I use that quite a lot if you're trying to sustain a note or a vocal.
Well, interestingly, at that kind of time period, stuff started to go a bit sour for Atari, and they started kind of getting out of the scene, and they were struggling. Did you ever go and meet people at Atari or any of the industry people or corporate?
No, I think they were probably out of fashion by the time I started using them. they were probably on the way out. I mean, most things that by the time I get to use it, it's generally like on the way out, and people go, "Oh, you're not still using that, are you?" I've only just started, actually. I do remember one trip with Beats International. We went to Tokyo, and somebody from Atari did come and see us and gave us a load of sweatshirts and merch. But that was the extent of my. I think by then they were already. I think it was by then. I think the merch was already kind of sort of semi-ironic, old school gamers. I was their OG kind of thing.
Yeah.
Everybody else was.
We actually had a guy from Atari UK, Daryl Still, on the podcast years ago. And he mentioned that he used to kind of go around with a few of the groups that were using Ataris. He said Captain Sensible, they loaned him like about £10,000 worth of monitors and equipment, and he stole it all, apparently. Never got it back. So what
I do know was that when I really got into it, and when my first Atari packed up, I learned very quickly that they were absolutely piss cheap, because everyone had one and everyone had moved on. So you just go into a shop and you go, "Have you got a 1080?" And they went, "How many do you want?" And I'm like, "How many have you got?" They went, "About 15. And I was like, "How much are they?" They went, "tenner." So I was like, "Yeah." So I bought about 6. So I still got spares. I mean, I've still got the Atari in the studio and it still works.
Oh, so when you started getting onto like becoming Fatboy Slim and doing that stuff, you still had the setup that you've just mentioned, and you still had exactly everything, and you just slipped into that and then started producing.
Yeah, every single Fatboy Slim record was made on Creator, run on Atari.
Was there anything about mastering or anything? Were you like, hiding that you'd kind of done it on Atari and then putting it out? Because a lot of contemporaries at the time were using like new pieces of software that had come out, Pro Tools, stuff like that.
My engineer would mix in Pro Tools. By the end of the 20 years at the other end of Fatboy Slim, he would mix it in Pro Tools. But no, I mean, I just used to run it straight out of the desk into a DAT player. That was the funny thing. Like when we did the first Fatboy Slim album, and things were starting to take off, but I'd done the whole thing in my bedroom at home, and they were going, "Oh, we should make a video." I'm like, "What, really?" And they were like, yeah. And it's like, I'm like, "How much would it cost me?" And they went like, "Oh, we'll just make a cheap one, like 35 grand. I'm like, 35 grand? It's like, do you know the budget for recording this entire album was the cost of 3 DAT tapes to master it onto, and the coffee that I drank whilst making it. And you're now expecting me to shell out 35 grand to make a video. But no, I mean, that was the beauty of it. I mean, like I said, I used to use this studio called SL in Brighton when I was working on 2-inch. And one night I was doing a remix and I hadn't finished it. I'd been in the studio all night, and at 8 o'clock the next morning they had another session coming in. So they had to boot me out of the studio, and I hadn't finished it. And so I just went home and I did it on the equipment that I had at home, put it in the DAT machine, and then sent it off and didn't tell anyone. Didn't go, "By the way, I didn't use a professional recording studio." And it was like, and they went, "Oh, this is brilliant. This sounds great. We love it." And so from then on, I was like, "Why am I paying all this money to go into a 24-track studio when most of the stuff is coming live out of my thing and I could just do it at home?" So with a little upgrade of a few extra compressors and stuff like that. And from then on, I made everything at home. That would have been just before the first Fatboy album. So the Beats International stuff and the Freak Power stuff, we were still working in professional studios. And then Fatboy Slim was, the first project that I've done where I made everything at home.
It's interesting. I remember reading, do you remember the song White Town, Your Woman, that was in the charts? I think it was number 1, wasn't it? I remember reading then that this was basically a kid who made it on his Atari ST in his bedroom. I remember then reading about it thinking, that's insane that it's gone from, you needed multi-million-pound studios before, but it kind of, I guess it opened up music to a lot more people, the fact that you could now do this from home.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, well, now people can do it on a phone on the bus. Yeah. It went from like, you need it, or these... I mean, do you think about like when we first wanted to use samplers, there was the Synclavier and there was the not the emulator. They were the first two samplers. They cost the price of like an average like 2 up, 2 down house.
Yeah,
and were the size of one room of that house. And then it just got, you know, as technology made things smaller and more accessible, then and the music changed because, you know, you went from Trevor Horn being able to put a big orchestral stab and play a little tune on it to you've now got the, you know, you can now do everything in your laptop. You, like I said, you know, potentially do it on your phone. And it's great because it means more people they've got access to do it. It also, unfortunately, means that more people who maybe shouldn't be doing it still get to do it. Because before you'd have to earn your chops for somebody to spend the money to put you in a studio. You must have done a pretty good demo.
Yeah.
Whereas now people can do finished albums at home with no real A&R or quality control.
Or even use AI, but yeah, we won't get into that.
Christ knows where that's going to take us. But it was fun. I mean, I kind of feel like I've lived through a golden age of you know, where first thing was like being in a band, there's a bass guitar and drums, and if one of your parents is rich, you might be able to afford a monophonic synthesizer. You know, I've gone from that to, you know, everything that's happened in between, you know, cassettes, CDs, different formats. I've kind of feel like I've lived through a golden age of recorded music or of pop music in general.
I kind of like that you have it in your house as well, because we've got these kind of like geeky man cave rooms going on, and is this like your kind of historic room, or do you actually go in there and use it?
No, this isn't my geek room. This is my working office. But
in your geek room, do you jump in and occasionally have a blast on the Atari?
Well, no, my geek room is my office. There's no distinction between this. Is I just noticed looking around. I just noticed a really geeky thing. I'll see if I can line it up for you. I don't know if you can see, but there's a VU meter.
Oh, nice! Yeah,
nice. Yeah, I wanted to walk.
VU meter that's just basically running. I've just got a VU meter that just measures what goes on in the room. It's just on a microphone. Just because I love VU meters.
I love that. Yeah, very analog and warm. Yeah, really nice.
Yes, yeah. No, I'm definitely an analog rather than digital. I'm not vinyl. I have an enormous amount of vinyl for many years. It was my tool of my trade. But people go, "Oh, do you ever want to play vinyl sets again?" I'm like, no. Yeah. The way you DJ now is like. It's like saying to someone who's driving a Ford Mondeo, it's like, do you miss the penny farthing?
The days of carrying record boxes versus a USB stick in your pocket. Yeah.
Oh, Christ. Yeah. Well, no, it's not just that. It's everything about it. It means you can be so much more creative as well as not having to lug the records around. There's one thing vinyl isn't, it's solid. And you can't dance. I mean, when I first started DJing on CDJs, I'm like, oh my God, I can dance up and down and the records won't jump.
Yeah, the bounce. Actually, I forgot about the bounce.
30 years of dancing sideways like that, because if you jump, the record would jump. And then they would, records are the most unstable, unforgiving things in the world. No, there's no stability. Like I said, it's proper primitive, prehistoric stuff compared to what DJs, the equipment we have now.
I mean, let's get into the Fatboy Slim stuff and what you were kind of using. Then you mentioned sticking with the Atari ST, and obviously when Rockefeller Skank came around, massive song in 1998. I mean, were you running up to any limitations with your equipment? Did you kind of have to like work to the limits of it then when you were producing that track?
I didn't have to work to the limits. I enjoyed working to the limits. I enjoyed squeezing everything you could out of whatever equipment I had. But obviously, around that time, I think around the time of the second album, we bought an S1000 because that had like 2.5 minutes of sampling. So if I was doing a remix, I could put the whole vocal in it. But I never learned how to use it because I wrote everything on the S950. So my engineer would just edit the vocals on the S1000 and I would write all the music No, but then, like I said, I'd splashed out on a second S950. They were both fully modded up. So I had all the sample time I needed, and I had 16 MIDI channels, and that was all I ever needed. I didn't ever need for everything else. I mean, there was a couple of there's times when we had to buy a microphone. If I'm, sometimes when we had a vocalist, I did a whole load of stuff with David Byrne, and we're like, we think we should buy a better mic for David to use. He might not be happy with an old 58. So yeah, but no, I never felt, and in fact, my love affair with making music ended when I had set myself up a laptop with a DAW in it, and I had every drum machine, every access to every sample in the world, and I just sat there and looked at it for 2 years and nothing happened.
Yeah,
and that was kind of when I just didn't know where to start. Before I would start, it's like, I've just got this new bit of kit, I'm going to find out what I can do with it, or I've just bought this bunch of records from some thrift store in Seattle, and I'm just going to go through them and try and find some bits to make a record out of. But faced with the whole of recorded music to sample and every single instrument at your fingertips and all there in one box where you can access them all at the same time, I just froze and haven't really seriously made music since.
Well, it's interesting you think of that. I mentioned when Rockefeller Skank came out and the Fatboy Slim stuff was blowing up. I mean, around that time, as club culture and like super clubs were growing in the UK in like the mid to late 90s, video games, it kind of felt like were coming more into the mainstream with stuff like the PlayStation coming out. And I remember seeing like, PlayStations in the corner of nightclubs. I remember Ministry of Sound, I think, had a room or something at one stage, and it kind of felt like they were kind of growing together. I mean, and even though you mentioned at the start you're not a gamer, I do know that your music was licensed in, heaps of video games. So did you ever kind of go to any launches or any events or anything? Were you ever involved in that world back then?
You see, you're trying to bring me into the gaming thing again, aren't you? It's not going to work. No, for ages, I tons of people would go, oh yeah, FIFA 98 to me. Like, I understood what the hell they were on. And it was about 6 months of like, why did people say FIFA 98 to me? And they're like, oh, Rockefeller Skank was on FIFA 98. So when you played FIFA 98, you heard Rockefeller Skank over and over again whenever you played it. And so it was kind of, but for them, it was like, that was their entry point to me because they were too young to be in nightclubs. And so that was, but I don't remember ever being asked, do you want to be in this video game? I probably said, yeah, whatever.
There's one more gaming question, which was the
Smurfs.
The Smurfs. Yeah. Why were you involved with a Smurfs game? Yeah.
Well, that basically, I was absolutely brassic. I had a nasty divorce, which I couldn't afford to pay for, and I was skint. This was after. Where was it? After Beats International. There was a wilderness 2 years. I didn't make any decent music, and I wasn't getting paid for anything. And I had, I had debts, and I was one PPL check away from having to declare myself bankrupt. And it's, what do you do? It's like, and the two things I did, which I'm sort of ashamed about, but they had to do it. I just got offered this Smurfs game. Do you want to write the music for a Smurfs game? We'll pay you £1,000 to demo it. And I was like, I need that £1,000. So I wrote some music. I don't think it ever got used. But that was kind of, I used that as a thing of how low I'd stoop. The other thing I did was I sold all my sample collection. I did a sample CD called Skip to My Loops, which I only did because I needed money. I needed to pay bills. So they're things that I'm not particularly proud of. Yeah, no, somebody else. I don't. It wasn't one of you, was it? Somebody the other day got in touch and said, I read about your Smurf thing. No, I watched I played every version of the Smurf game for around.
Try to track it down.
It was. And I'm like, I honestly don't think it got used. I just demoed up a load of rubbish, hoping that I wouldn't get the job. Well, I needed £1,000.
It's one of your lost tracks now. Then people are probably selling for a fortune on white label.
But going on the fact that I was floundering musically at that point anyway, and I deliberately did a bad job because I didn't want to be on a video game. So it's probably not my best work, even if it still exists somewhere.
Well, one of the things, part of one of your best works was with Spike Jonze when you did the Praise You video. And, you know, the kind of lo-fi, just handheld camera, weird culty kind of look of, you know, people doing I don't know, was it pre-flash mob? A kind of just a flash mob in an airport? Yeah, it was a really interesting aesthetic.
I mean, that was a wonderful moment in my life when I met Spike Jonze, because like I said, I didn't want to make videos. And then on the first album, we literally made, I made one video where it was just my mate staring at the camera for like 2 minutes. And then on the really big acid breakdown, someone leans in and writes, "Why make videos?" across his forehead. That was kind of how situationist I was about it. But then when we signed to American record company, they was like, "Oh, we got to have videos." And by now we were getting on the radio and there was a sniff of a hit. So we had to make videos. So the first one was Rockefeller Skank, and they had this American director who he sold it to me really well. It was going to be one long focus pull, you know, like when everything is coming towards the camera, and it seemed quite arty and so I agreed to do that, and I flew over to America to do my cameo in it, and when I got there, I realized that he'd abandoned the idea of the continuous zooming shot. And it was just a load of cliches of like break dancers and jacked up, those Latino cars that go up and down. And it was just every kind of dance music cliche cobbled together without this great. And I was like, oh, despondent. I went back to my hotel and there's this VHS in the room saying Rockefeller Skank, and the letter that said, "I saw this guy dancing to your record outside the Chinese theatre. Thought you might like it. Love, Spike." And it was this crazy crackhead dancing to Rockefeller Skank, doing like really weird interpretational ballet hip hop fusion in the middle of the street outside the Chinese theatre in LA, like falling in, nearly getting run over, you know, annoying people, everybody just ignoring him. And I was like, this is the video we should be making, not this expensive, cliche-ridden Hollywood, you know, blockbuster. This is funny and it's stupid and it's irreverent and it sums up. And it was made in the same way that the records were made, you know, just taking other ideas and samples very cheaply and just putting them together with that flavor rather than that gloss. And so I went to the record company. I said, "Right, can we cancel the shoot and just use this?" And they went, "No, but you can work it with him on the next one." And so Spike worked with me on that, on Weapon of Choice with Christopher Walken, which is
great one, yeah.
The Gangster Tripping, and he just turned it around. And from then on, I was allowed to make videos as interesting and wild as I wanted the music to be. Because in those days, that was proper. There was the MTV thing. You just had to have a load of girls with big boobs dancing behind you and making you look good. And, you know, it was like, it was so cliche.
It was the opposite. Yeah, that's why it stood out, I think.
But Spike was such a genius. He would either play that game and take the mickey out of it. He did some, because when I found out when this tape was from, when I said, "Who's this Spike guy?" And they went, "Oh, Spike Jonze." And I was like, "Have I heard that name?" And they went, "Oh, that Björk video that with the big production number on It's So So Quiet, the dog with the broken arm for Daft Punk, the Funk," and basically he'd made and the Blur one with the milk carton. He'd made the only 3 videos that I'd enjoyed in the last 2 years. I was like, I need to work with this guy. But it was, that was a great, very fortuitous. And I think Spike is a genius. And, you know, when he got onto making feature films, he made things like Being John Malkovich, which is just the craziest.
Oh, yeah. I saw that the other day.
It's the craziest film you've ever seen.
When Malkovich goes inside his own head. That's a great bit. You mentioned that you did a gig at one point at the House of Commons as well, like during the kind of height of the Fatboy Slim era. What was that like? That must have been weird.
Yeah, it was really weird. It was as weird as you'd imagine it. It was not very good, as you can imagine, playing to a load of MPs in their bar after there was actually a vote on downstairs They were actually the Commons was open, and there was like a late night vote that went on till 10:30 at night, and I'm just DJing in their members bar, which was, I mean, it was funny. It was a great thing to say, but yeah, in terms of gigs, it was like a bad wedding where no one knew each other and no one was drunk enough.
Just
I think I got
drunk MP dancing.
I think I got about 4 MPs dancing. But the point, but I mean, I started with the in the beginning there was Jack and Jack made a groove, and the groove was our house, and this is our house, and the house grew. And so I did that, and I also slipped an anonymous mask on, a Guy Fawkes mask on halfway through the set, which I thought got my little digs in.
Well, I mean, around that time as well, music was changing. The MP3 came along. We got, stuff like file sharing became a thing, obviously, with Napster. And I mean, what did you think of kind of the DIY approach of it, though? Because there's stuff like, the MP3 mashup scene came along at that time as well.
I missed a huge amount of it because I remember Zoe bought me an iPod. And she's like, "Oh, it's brilliant! This, you can get all your music in this." And I was like, "Great! How do I, where do I record it in?" And they went, "Oh no, you link it with your iTunes on your laptop." I'm like, "I don't have a laptop. I don't have an iTunes thing." And it's like, so for 2 years, I think I gave it away to my brother in the end. No, I'm a late adopter, so I missed all that. The Napster thing, I really love. I love the. It was one of those moments when you're torn being a musician, because it's like, do you believe in like copyright, or do you believe, I've used to write on my records, home taping is fun and saves money, rather than home taping is music, killing music. But there was this whole thing of home taping will kill music. Of course it won't. If you really love the band, you'll buy the original record. Didn't realise quite how far that was going to go with streaming. Obviously, who could have seen that coming? But the most interesting thing was that even I could see that the record companies should have got in bed with Napster, and they should have bought Napster and incorporated it into what they did. And what they did was just stuck their head in the sand and hoped it would go away, and lost, and music. The music industry, as we know it, was nearly wiped out because they didn't get on it, and they were similarly late with streaming.
I think it's really interesting. I was listening to the charts this week, and you have Satisfaction Skank in there, which is a great mix, which is like in that old mashup style where you've got the Rolling Stones mixed in with Satisfaction and, Rockefeller Skank. It's really interesting. How did you kind of get to getting that released? And I'd heard it before. I'm sure it's been out there for years,
Yeah, well, no, I made it like 25 years ago. I made it probably about 6 months after Rockefeller Skank was in the charts, and I was bored of playing it in my DJ sets, but everyone expected to hear it. So I'm a fan of the mashup, and one day normally when you're driving along and you've just heard one song and then you hear the next song and you're still singing the old song over the top of the new song, and you think, oh, that kind of works. So I just did it in my bedroom at home and made an acetate of it, just so that I had a battle weapon when I was DJing that nobody else had. And also I had a version of Rockefeller Skank that I wasn't really bored with. And so I started playing it, and then everybody seemed to really love it. I played it on the radio a couple of times. And so everyone was going, oh, you should release it. So we went to the Rolling Stones and said, we've got this mashup and people like it, and this whole mashup culture thing's happening. And they just went, no. I mean, absolutely not. And we were like, okay. And then another year went by, it got bootlegged. There was a bootleg of a rip off the radio, and then someone actually remade it, what I'd done. And so there's 2 bootlegs going around. And so we went back to them a year later and said, there really is a demand for this record, let's do something together. And they went, nah. And then roll on about another 5 years later, the Rolling Stones asked me to remix Sympathy for the Devil. And so while I was doing that, I said, oh, more about on the B-side. Maybe I've got that mashup. We could put that out. They went, no. And so we gave up. And 25 years later, we got the call from them saying, would you like to put it out? So, and which I'm really chuffed about. because I mean, I'm chuffed that people still want it and it still sounds all right. It's still a good idea, but it's nice to have, having been under the radar with it for 25 years, it feels good to be like, you know, it feels like I've had a mistress for 25 years and now I can take her out in public and show her off in restaurants.
Did you make that on the Atari ST as well then, the mashup?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's cool. I love the fact that there's a track in the charts now then that was made on the Atari ST. Yeah, I think that's awesome.
Everything I've done as Fatboy Slim, apart from up to Eat Sleep Rave Repeat. Eat Sleep Rave Repeat was the last tune I made on the Atari. I remember the last studio session I did was with Rizzle Kicks. You know Rizzle Kicks?
Yeah.
I did a track with them. I did a few tracks with them. I did a track called Mama Do the Hump. And when they were like young kids, that I knew them from around town. They lived Brighton boys, and they really wanted to make a tune with me. So I said, okay. And then they called me Uncle Norman because of the age gap. And when they walked in my studio, they just started giggling. And I was like, what are you giggling about? They went, what is this? I went, that's an Atari. That's how we make the music. They went, really? I was like, yeah. So, and then they tell everybody this. They went into the studio, it's just like some relic from the 80s, which of course it is, but it still worked. And I've showed them up by making the record with the Atari and the S950. But that was the last time I dared show the studio off to anyone apart from someone like yourself who wanted to look at it from a historical angle.
Yeah, we appreciate it.
It's all still there. Most of it still works. Every now and then, when where somebody's making a sort of behind the scenes film, we fire it up, and most of it still works.
That's pretty amazing. Well, I think it's great that you've got a tune that was made on the Atari in the charts, and it's been fantastic to have you on.
Well, no, can I just point out that every single Beats International tune was made on the Atari. Every single Freak Power tune was made on the Atari, and every single Fatboy Slim tune up until Eat Sleep Rave Repeat was all made on the Atari.
Long live the Atari.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, Norman, thank you so much for coming. Even though you said you had nothing, no interest in gaming,
well,
it's been a great nostalgic chat. Yeah, we've loved it. So, yeah, appreciate it.
Well, it was more about music than technology or gaming, which is probably it means I could bring something to the conversation. Nice to talk to you.